Hey there, this is Ryan Kingsline, founder of ZBrush Workshops. In my last video, I talked a little bit about going pro and what that really meant for me. Going pro really meant that I started to take myself more seriously. Not only did I take myself more seriously, that's the obvious answer, but what it really meant is that this was a job, and this was a serious job. I clocked in, I clocked out, and it wasn't personal. And Steven Pressfield's book, The War of Art, was a really important part of that going pro process. That and Richard McDonald's workshop, where I got to see what, this uber pro was really like, and what it was like to have this completely functioning sculpture studio. Because, a lot of us don't have that, that vision. We don't have that view. And, we live in a day and age where sculptors is still kind of archaic, just Luddites digging in clay. But seeing a full-on working workshop where they're making bronzes, like $500,000 bronzes, where you're seeing those made in front of you, and then Pressfield's book, and all the other stuff that was going on in my life around that time, because I had recently left Pixelogic, and I was committing myself to a resident artist position, and having to explore all that. All of that really meant that I had to ramp up and I had to find ways to do that. And anatomy, as I mentioned, was one of those elements that I needed to take more control of. And I needed to battle this debate that I had inside myself of, well, if you're really good, you don't need to study anatomy. If you really know what you're doing, if you're really an artist, then you're just going to get in and start to create something, and God will provide. Well, it doesn't work that way, right? Part of going pro is you start to take control of all of that, and you start to realize that, you are the one who's responsible. It's up to you. So all of that, that's what going pro was really all about for me. What does it look like to go pro? What does it look like to begin to take control of your knowledge and your destiny? What does that enable you to do? That's what I want to share with you today. I want to look over this Sculpting Thor workshop and dissect a little bit of what I've learned, what I'm thinking, and the areas and the places where I'm kind of pulling secret knowledge in. Things like lines inside the body is something that, all of us, it's just something that, you learn. And when you learn it, it's incredibly powerful. And you do it without ever showing anybody that you're doing it. The Greeks had these lines in the body, before they basically ended up using Greek or Latin, to describe anatomy. The Greeks were actually sculpting all of this stuff. Beautiful, realistic stuff. I think it's the end of the Hellenistic period, if I'm correct. But they had lines that they would draw on the body. So, for example, from the insertion of the deltoid, along the deltoid, between the deltoid and the pectoralis, along the clavicle, and back out. That's a nice, beautiful little arc. The arc of your rib cage, Apollo's arch. The front was considered Apollonian because the abdominal muscles were basically a column. Pectoralis muscles and the clavicles basically a pediment going across. The back was considered Dionysian because the lats, the trapezius, the teres major, the deltoids, everything is at an angle and, not as rational and easy to decode as the front is, as all of us who have tried to sculpt backs know. But what does it look like when you start to go pro and you start to take control of things? Part of it is you learn things like lines in the body. You learn how to follow the sartorius to create a really perfect valley in the leg and start to separate forms. So let's take a look at this video and let's look at what it means to dissect or what it is that we're dissecting as we create.
This is the model that I created
well, the maquette, let me call it that way, because this is really just a quick sketch. There's a lot of things that need to happen here. But this is the quick sketch that I created in the Sculpting Thor preview. And the idea is at this point that we want to be able to test a whole bunch of different poses. So we need to be able to do this quickly, rapidly. You know, if you're a sculptor, you're working in clay, you create these clay maquettes, you try to do them as quickly as you humanly possible. But when you're working in ZBrush, you're working in a medium that has a lot more power, in my view, for this particular use, for these maquettes. You can ramp through these things pretty fast, and so I created a whole bunch. Anyways, when I'm doing this, the idea is that I have this anatomical knowledge that is allowing me to get in and establish these broad forms. So for example, if I just take this view right here, you know, what is it that I'm looking at? Well, in a moment we're going to take a look at the actual video itself, but the first thing I end up doing is I have conceptualized the opening of the neck, I've got the rib cage in there, and all of that stuff is part of my knowledge. I'm quickly pulling a oval in there, I'm quickly pulling a box in for the hip, and then I'm going to be able to pull the cylinder for the leg out of that, and getting all of that stuff intact. These simple shapes of the oval, the box, you know, getting all of that done quickly really requires you to have a certain amount of this internalized. And that's what's really important to me about going pro and about studying anatomy, is you're going to start from the ground up. You're going to start with the skeleton. You're going to build all of the muscles. You're going to get this detailed knowledge, but you're also going to be going in and sculpting the final result of all of this and making sure that all of these parts that you've studied will refer back and help you understand how everything is really just a circle, a cone, or really just a cube. If you can constantly be on the lookout for these simplified shapes, you're going to be, you know, doing pretty well. But also one of the things you're going to see in there is how I start to use the clay brush and I start to create the contour, which again requires you to understand the parts. So being able to say, take the pectoralis muscle, wrap that around exactly in the places where it needs to, wrap the lat around, get that where it's supposed to be going, and then know that the side of the rib cage is going to have its own form that you have to adjust or you know, account for, knowing how you can kind of build all of this stuff and get the whole 3D sense of it all. That's what's really going to be important, and was really important to me for studying anatomy. I needed to be able to understand how all of this stuff related. If you're an illustrator, you got to know this so that you do shade values correctly. If you're a sculptor, you need to know how to do this so that you can block this stuff out in minutes rather than days. And that's the key, because as you'll see in the next period, the process of blocking out this maquette is, at the end of the day, something like a 15-20 minute process. There's some time spent with other aspects of it, but the majority of it is, you know, 15-20 minutes of sculpting. And through the entire thing, I'm picking out these key points. So I'm picking out the external oblique, and I'm making sure that I understand what that is. I'm picking out the lat, and I'm making sure that I have the form for the lat. I'm picking out the deltoid, and I'm making sure that I have the form for the deltoid. You know, I get a little extra hit right here. I'm making sure that the bicep is intact. I'm making sure that I've got the ridge muscles for the forearm and that those are going in correctly towards the thumb. Getting the expanse of the sternocleidomastoid, the expanse of the pectoralis. You know, all of these things are in my mind. I'm also here, if we take a look at the thigh, I'm thinking about the rectus femoris. You know, the rectus femoris here.
Where is this originating? Where is it going? Well, it is originating deep inside here in what's called the I was about to say infraorbital triangle. It arises in the anterior, inferior iliac crest. So that means there's a superior and an inferior. Superior is above, inferior is below. Anyways, rectus femoris is heading in there. Then you've got your tensor fasciae latae. Great muscle, love it. Makes me think of Starbucks. And vastus lateralis. Okay, coming around, getting the medius, gluteus maximus. You know, and I gave this guy some serious junk in the trunk here. So, you know, he's a superhero with some serious baggage. Bicep femoris, you know, trying to get the sense of the bicep femoris in there. All of that stuff. When you know what these elements are, when you've named it, you have said this is the gluteus medius. The gluteus medius originates along the ilium, okay, and then it inserts down here in the great trochanter, or really actually the iliotibial tract, but we'll just say the great trochanter for now. When you know all of that, and then on top of it, you've learned how the form behaves, you know, the contour of it all, then you are in control on a totally different level than you were before. So let's take a look at some of the video of sculpting Thor, and let me see if I can pick some points where I was doing some internalizing, some internal thinking of the processes and the tools and tricks and whatnot, and see if I can't make those external. Here's a sped up time lapse of the sculpting Thor. So I started with this base mesh, which is a totally separate sculpt. But then I went in and I got some maquettes, some little 8-head maquettes. I started playing with some poses, looking at stuff on Google, seeing what kind of interested me. The maquettes are really a great way to just get an overall sense of things and just play with ideas. But you really can't figure things out until you get in and you start to actually sculpt. So here's one example where I got in and I kind of liked this. I wanted to take this pose further. So what I did is just, I think I actually sculpted directly on the form itself. And I'm going in and establishing a couple of really important structural elements. Now this workflow that I used for this piece actually had some problems. It led me down the wrong path, but let me illustrate the concepts that I'm thinking about. First thing I'm doing is establishing this front plane. I'm also establishing basically the side profile for the lat, because I know that, you know, the lats are going to be this big huge muscle. It's going to create a massive shape. And I establish a transition plane for the rib cage. I also work to establish, you know, the bowl of the belly, and try to put in some of the iliac crest and just get the form intact there. So I'm working to get these structural elements. But one of the things that I ran into when I was doing this particular process was it was just getting too detailed. You know, this is a lot of information to be getting at this point. And over time that started to lead me astray, and see I'm starting to put the pectoralis muscle in there. And so I'm putting some little indicators for the pectoralis. I'm putting a little indicator for the rib cage, the arch of Apollo, I like to call it. Getting the abdominal muscles in there, getting the flow, hoping that everything still kind of works nicely. But I'm really thinking about the parts at this point, the individual parts, and that's going to lead me astray, and it's going to take longer for me to fix. This is another really good example. You know, I've got the rectus femoris I'm putting in. I'm getting the side plane. I'm trying to create the transition of this. Let's create the side plane for the vastus lateralis. So I'm trying to create the separation of space of these guys. But again, I'm at this point, the form wasn't intact. Like you can see up here, very simple, primitive shape. I don't have any of the volume of this model yet. I'm thinking about the individual parts. But one of the things that's really important when you study anatomy is you have to learn the individual parts, but you have to immediately apply that to the part as a whole. Because if you study the muscles independently, individually, you will learn them individually. You will never learn the most important part, which is how the whole thing works when you put it all together, right? So here I am, I've got a lot of, what looks like, to me anyways, great individual bits of information. I'm excited about it. I go in, I start to do a little bit more, I remesh it. I have exciting stuff in here, and this workflow will work for some people. I like to say there's two types of artists. There's two types of everything. Depends on your perspective. But if you bear with me, imagine there's two types of artists. There's Baroque artists and there's classical artists. Classical artists, I like to liken back to the workflow of painters like Jean-Jacques Louis David and the neoclassical school, where you make your drawing in pencil first and then you go forward and add the coloring, all of that. Baroque artists are like Rembrandt or Titian's later period, or let's say some of Peter Paul Rubens, although Rubens isn't the best example. These are guys who just paint directly on the canvas, alla prima, and just get it all out and start to work with masses of value, shade, and color as quickly as possible. That's in contrast to people who plan it out meticulously and work on the parts. I bring that up. Okay, two types of artists. I bring that up because what I'm doing right now is I'm focusing on individual parts. That's not really classical, but at the end of the day, there's artists who focus on big picture, there's artists who focus on the details first. And then, of course, there's the rest of us who really actually do both. But if you separate it, right now I'm working on small items. So I'm separating out the pectoralis, I've got the lat in there, I'm trying to get the deltoid placed, trying to get all of these guys in here. I'm trying to pull the rib cage in and get that talking to me in the way that I need it to, the abdominal muscles, all of that, and again, get that really nice sense of the rib cage, not the rib cage, but the pelvis and the form there. I've got all these individual pieces. But unfortunately, I'm not the type of person who works well with these individual pieces. So I actually spent 45 minutes on this, struggling with all these individual pieces. And what happened is the rib cage would get too large in one place, and then the lats would be too small, and the pectoralis would be too small, and the external oblique would come in, but then this just got out of hand and I got this little tiny bicep. I don't have any tricep to speak of, and you have to be very determined to focus on parts, because this looks like I'm walking through the valley of the suck. You can get there from anywhere at the end of the day. It's just this required a lot more work. I actually smoothed it out, remeshed it a couple of times, trying to get the results. And then I changed my tactic. And the tactic I'm going to show you next was really important, and one of those things that I learned, I shouldn't say learned, but one of those things that was reinforced by my time with Richard McDonald, and it was really something I learned with Al Gurry and Stuart Feldman and the guys at PAFA. But it was that confluence of energy with Pressfield and Richard and everything that just really drove home the point that I needed to get the major parts first. So here we are. We're looking at a new workflow. So at this point, I'm not thinking about muscles. You don't see me putting a pectoralis in there. What you do see me doing is establishing a general volume and focusing on that general volume. and establishing that general volume. So you might think anatomy is all about the muscles and the parts, but anatomy for me, and Anatomy 2.0 as I define it, is about the whole thing. It's about all of it. So here we go. I'm using the inflate brush, and I'm working on volume. I'm getting a little bit of muscle in there. You know, that is the lat. But most important is that that's a flat plane, and it's just one plane. You know, I haven't broken out a deltoid in there. I haven't put the spine in there. I haven't done a lot to get the gluteus medius. They're kind of in there, kind of suggested, but not really. At a certain point, that changes. When I have the volume intact, I go in just like I did right here, and I start to be much more specific. That's a block. I'm going to come in and get the block here. I'm starting to define the lat. Define that lat. Define the vastus medialis. Define the rectus femoris. Define the abdominal plane. Okay, define that rib cage a little bit. All of these little parts and pieces get worked. Then I also start to find these lines in the body. As I mentioned before, you can take these lines. So watch this line. You know, take the lat, or really what's the line of the ribs in the back, coming in with the external oblique, switching in between. You've got the fat or the meat of your external oblique here. You've got rib cage here. You've got the meat of your lat there. And in between there you get this beautiful little line that flows along the body. Just one of many lines that you start to find. I'm starting to define the contours a little bit, but the contours I'm going to get here in a moment. Mostly what I'm doing is hitting anatomical notes. I'm saying to myself, lat, pectoralis, vastus lateralis, rectus femoris, medialis, abdominal muscles. I'm not focused on their individual shape. I'm focused on the global picture of them. Now let's zoom ahead. Now we're going to focus on contours. And this is where your detailed study of anatomy is going to be essential. Establishing my pectoralis. I'm working on insert, or I should say origin, along the clavicle, sternum, okay, 6th, 7th rib. And then the insertion into the side of the humerus. And how does that relate to the deltoid? How do all of these guys connect? The clavicular head, the sternal head, the 6th and 7th rib coming in. How do all these pieces relate? How do they connect? Get the contours of them. What are the individual pieces or parts of the trapezius? Are you aware that the trapezius has what would basically be 3 parts? It has an ascending, it has a descending, and it has a transversal portion. And these all have different important characteristics. You know, knowing where C7 is, drawing your line for C7 to the spine of the scapula. These are all the tricks that you learn, you know, when you study in Anatomy 2.0. You got to find these lines. Let me spend another second on that, actually. I want to really hone in on this idea of the line from C7. So one of the things I really emphasize, you've got C7, that's the 7th cervical vertebrae, and you can put a line from your spine of the, well, I'm sorry, from C7 to the middle of the spine of your scapula. That line really separates out the transversal portion and then the portion that's ascending, coming from the bottom. Separates those out nice and clean. And if you know that line is there, or if you know that concept is available to you, then it's going to speed up your sculpting. It just does. It's a great thing. That's why we do it. That's why the Greeks did it. You know, if you know these lines are there, then you know, or you can quickly get yourself out of trouble, and vice versa, into trouble. Putting the pectoralis in there, really getting it stretched, and the forearms. Oh my, forearms. Forearms are a pain. Forearms are tough. But what's really cool is if you sit down and you study them and you make them, you will understand them. Plus, if you pay attention to one kind of one quick lecture, which I can give you now actually, and this was given to me by my good friend Cesar de Cole Jr. Forearm muscles can be split in three groups. You've got your ridge muscles, your extensors. So let's go here. Let me draw or illustrate it. So extensors, ridge, and you have your flexors. Those are your three groups. On top of that, you've got a kind of a limited number of movements that your arm can do. You can extend your hand. You can flex your hand. And you can twist. And wouldn't you know, but these partly combine and relate. Extensors extend the hand. Flexors flex the hand. Ridge muscles, partly, bear with me, twist. If you know that, and then you know their insertions and origins, then you'll always be able to figure out the muscles of the hand, no matter what position they are. The first thing that you have to do is find out, where is the wrist, what's the orientation, and then where are my condyles. So you've got your medial epicondyle, your lateral epicondyle, and then you've got your ulna, and your ulna is heading down to the styloid process of the ulna. From that point on, I'm not going to give you too much here after this, but the extensors are going to go to the top of the hand, the flexors are going to go to the bottom of the hand, and the ridge muscles are going to twist around. That's what they do. Knowing that puts you in a position of power when you have to go in and figure these things out. And that's all stuff I cover in Anatomy 2.0. That's kind of a quick look at that, what I'm thinking as I go in and sculpt this. And I know this got to be a bit of a long video, but it's important for me to kind of start to break down what's the value. What does it look like when you go pro? What's the value of going pro? Why do you need to sit down and study anatomy and learn all of these things? And it is so that you can do exactly what I'm doing right here. You can do this in, a half hour. You can do this in an hour. You can do this in 3 hours. Whatever. You're going to do it faster than you ever did before. It's not going to take you a day, a couple of days. You're going to know this stuff on a level that you never knew before. And you are going to be in control of your sculpting. So if we take a look back in ZBrush here, the idea is that inside your mind, you are quite literally building, or I shouldn't say building, but you have the muscles already there. You already know kind of what this is going to look like. You already have this muscle-bound beefcake sitting there in your brain, and you are able to put all of this down into your sculpt in no time whatsoever. Getting this into your brain is tough, but once it's there, it's like learning a language. Once it's there, you're done. It's there. It's part of you. You just have to keep exercising every now and then. But you have gone pro. You are now solid. Your sculpting will improve, and you have reached the next level. So I hope you enjoyed all this. I know it was quite long, and good luck with your sculpting.